Agnes Whitmore was 73 years old when she realized she had disappeared from her own home. It didn't happen all at once. There were no shouts, no suitcases thrown onto the porch, no dramatic confrontation in the hallway. It happened slowly. One door closed, then another, then a third. Until the world of a woman who had spent decades feeding, washing, caring, and loving was reduced to a 12 by 10-foot room at the back of a house she herself had helped build, year by year, payment by payment, with hands that had never once stopped working. "You don't need to be in the living room, Miss Agnes. I take care of everything here." That was the first sentence. It sounded like kindness. It was a boundary. Then came other sentences. "The kitchen is no place for you to be wandering around. Your visitors make us uncomfortable. This house needs peace and quiet. We manage your pension so it goes further. Don't worry." And Daniel, the son, the boy whose first day of school photograph Agnes kept in a worn wallet for 30 years. Daniel stayed silent. He looked the other way, left the room, disappeared. For 3 years, Agnes lived confined. She ate whatever appeared on a tray. She slept listening to the living room television she was no longer allowed to use. She woke up early out of habit and stood at the barred window watching the garden she had planted, now growing without her. $80 a month. That was what was left of Agnes's pension after Christine kept the rest to help with household expenses. $80. With $80, she bought the soap Christine didn't leave in her bathroom, the crackers she hid under the mattress, the notebook where she wrote at night when she couldn't sleep. And then, in the early hours of a cold March morning, with the sound of the Minnesota wind rattling her window, Agnes opened a small wooden box she had kept under her bed for 15 years. She took out a rusted key and made a decision. She left on her own 2 feet at 73, with $83 in her pocket and a key her dead husband had pressed into her hands with the words, "Keep this key, Agnes. One day you're going to need it." What Walter knew, and she didn't. What that key would open. What was waiting for her inside a forgotten storage property on the shores of Lake Superior. What would make Agnes Whitmore's name spoken aloud, with respect for the first time in years. That is what this story is about. Her full name was Agnes Louise Teller, but from the time she was 7 years old, everyone in the small town of Birchwood in rural Minnesota simply called her Agnes. The name suited her in a way people noticed without being able to explain. There was in her a kind of natural dignity, a way of entering a room that wasn't arrogance or vanity, but something quieter and deeper, like someone who knows her own worth without needing to announce it. Birchwood was a town of just under 7,000 people, where the winters were long and hard and the summers arrived in June, with a generosity that felt like a miracle after months of cold and ice. The town square had an old iron bandstand painted green, a white-steepled Lutheran church whose bells rang on Sunday mornings, and a row of ancient birch trees, hence the name, whose white bark caught the afternoon light in a way that made even long-time residents stop and look. At the Saturday farmers' market beneath those trees, women sold pies, fresh jams, handmade quilts, and smoked fish from the lake country. The smell of wild blueberries and fresh bread filled the air from early morning and only faded past midday. It was in that world that Agnes had been born, had grown up, and had buried the best and worst days of her life. She was born in February of 1950, the third daughter of Henrik Teller, a man who worked at the regional lumber mill and spent his weekends fishing the cold, clear lakes of northern Minnesota, and of Britta Olson Teller, a woman with strong hands and a warm, steady voice, who rose before the sun to make oatmeal from scratch and only lay down after checking that every child was asleep, every door was locked, and the kitchen stove was completely cold. The family home was modest. 4 rooms, hardwood floors worn smooth, a metal roof that pinged musically in the rain, which the children loved and Henrik pretended to find irritating. But it was a home rich in what mattered. There was always food, always conversation, and Britta was the kind of woman who understood that a home is built by warmth, not by square footage. Agnes learned to cook at age 8, standing on a step stool beside her mother, watching her hands work bread dough against the worn wooden counter with a confidence that seemed like magic. "It's the patience that does the work," Britta used to say. "We only guide it." Agnes never forgot that. It became a principle she applied to everything: cooking, raising her son, tending her garden. Don't force, guide, wait. Agnes's childhood was the childhood of many girls in rural Minnesota in that generation. School in the morning, household chores in the afternoon, church on Sunday, and the particular freedom of summer days spent at the lake, swimming in water so cold it took your breath away, and tasting of iron and pine. She was a good student, patient, precise. Her teacher, Mrs. Halvorson, used to say that Agnes had the mind of someone who would go far, which in the context of a small northern Minnesota town in the 1960s meant she might become a schoolteacher or a bookkeeper at the county office. But fate took the lead before any plan could take shape. At 18, at a community dance held at the town hall in honor of the summer solstice, Agnes danced with a young man who had arrived in Birchwood 6 weeks earlier. He had come from the Lake Superior region to work on the construction of a new county road through the northern corridor. His name was Walter. Walter Whitmore, 23 years old, lean and quiet, with carpenter's hands and a way of standing that suggested someone who had spent years outdoors measuring things carefully. He was the son of a commercial fisherman. He had grown up on the shores of Lake Superior. He knew how to read the weather by the color of the horizon and gauge the season by the behavior of the loons. When the band played and Walter extended his hand toward Agnes, she hesitated. He came back a second time. She shook her head again with a small smile. The third time she laughed and took his hand, and that was that. They courted for 2 years, with the knowledge of her parents, mostly, with the help of her cousin Ingrid, who passed notes between them with the discretion of a professional. Henrik, Agnes's father, mistrusted Walter with the healthy suspicion every father from a small town cultivated toward an outsider who arrived with quiet eyes and no local family to speak of. But Walter went to the house, sat in the kitchen, drank the strong coffee without making a face, and listened to Henrik's speech about responsibility and family with his head bowed and his hands in his lap. When Henrik finished, Walter stood up and said, "Mr. Teller, I don't have much yet, but I have my word, and my word is that Agnes will never go without as long as I'm standing." Henrik was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Then sit down and have another cup." They married in the fall of 1970 in a ceremony at the Lutheran church with 40 guests, a table of roast venison and wild rice, and a cake that Britta baked over 2 straight days. Agnes wore a dress of ivory cotton with embroidered detailing at the collar that she had sewn herself over 8 weeks. And when she walked down the aisle, she was so beautiful that her cousin Ingrid was crying before the pastor had even spoken a word. The first years of marriage were difficult, with the dignity of those who don't admit they're struggling. Walter and Agnes rented a small house on the edge of Birchwood, barely more than 4 rooms, with windows that rattled in the winter wind. Walter worked in construction, and on weekends he fished the local lakes to supplement their income. Agnes sewed blouses for hire, baked and sold bread at the front of the house in the mornings, and when the opportunity arose, she substituted for teachers at the elementary school for a nominal fee that still made a difference at the end of the month. They saved every penny with a discipline that outsiders found excessive, but it came from a silent understanding between the two of them. They didn't want to just survive. They wanted to build something solid. In 1975, after 5 years of saving, they bought a corner lot on Maple Avenue, 4 blocks from the town square. It was a bare lot with dry grass and a pile of old bricks left over from a demolished shed, but it was theirs, paid for, with the deed registered at the county office. Agnes still remembered the evening Walter came home with the papers, sat on the edge of the bed, and said without drama, as if simply stating a plain fact. "It's ours, Agnes. Now it's ours." The construction of the house took 4 years, not because they were slow, but because each phase depended on money they could gather without borrowing from anyone. Walter did what he could with his own hands on weekends. He had learned masonry and carpentry on the job sites where he'd worked, and he did not cut corners on materials. "Good wood and solid joints don't fail," he used to say. They moved into the house in 1979 when Daniel was 4 years old. It was a 5-room house: living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom with blue tile that Agnes had personally selected at the hardware store in the city, savoring that moment as a luxury she had waited years to have. The yard was generous, with a spruce tree in the back corner, a bed of herbs along the south wall, and a patch of wild strawberries that Agnes had transplanted from the lake country, and that returned every spring more abundantly than the year before. Agnes was the kind of woman her neighbors noticed, without being able to say exactly why. She was not loud or imposing, medium height, with dark blonde hair that began showing its first silver threads at 42, large capable hands that could roll a pie crust just as easily as repair a torn seam in a winter coat. Her eyes were gray-blue, the color of Lake Superior in November, and they had the habit of holding a person's gaze a moment too long, as if she were reading something they hadn't said. Those who knew her well recognized that look. It meant she had already formed an opinion and was only confirming it. Every morning before making coffee, she would go outside barefoot into the herb garden and stand there for a few minutes looking at the sky. It wasn't prayer. It wasn't meditation. She herself couldn't have explained it. It was simply the moment of the day when the world was quiet enough for her to hear herself. Walter called it Agnes's morning and never once interrupted it. Their son Daniel was born in 1975, in November, during a light snowfall. It was a long labor, and when Britta placed the baby in Agnes's arms, and he opened his eyes for the first time, Agnes felt something that had no name in any language. Daniel was a quiet baby, wide dark eyes watching everything, with an attention that was unsettling in a newborn. "This child is going to be very sharp," said Britta. And she was right. Daniel was intelligent, only that intelligence, without character, does different things than parents imagine. In childhood, Daniel was a son of impeccable surface, good grades, polite with adults, helpful with chores when people were watching. Agnes raised him with constant presence. She walked him to school, sat with him at night to review his lessons, sewed his Halloween costumes by hand when there wasn't money to buy them. For Daniel's 10th birthday, she spent 3 weeks saving to buy the bicycle he had pointed out in a shop window. She got up at 5 in the morning on his birthday to wrap it in ribbons and put it in the middle of the living room. When Daniel walked in and saw it, he stood still for a moment. Then he hugged his mother. And in that embrace, there was an authenticity Agnes kept inside herself for decades, in a place that didn't wither. But there was another side of Daniel that Agnes only allowed herself to see when it was impossible not to. Walter was more direct. One afternoon, when Daniel was about 16, Walter sat his son down at the kitchen table and stared at him for a long moment, without saying anything. Daniel lasted perhaps a minute before asking what was wrong. Walter said, "Nothing's happened yet, but it will if you don't fix what you need to fix inside yourself." Daniel didn't understand, or pretended not to. Walter never explained. He just kept looking at his son for a few more seconds, then got up, went to the yard, and stayed there until dinner. Agnes never forgot that scene. Many years later, when everything had happened, she would return to that moment and think. Walter knew. He always knew. The relationship between Agnes and Walter was the kind that deepens with the years instead of wearing down. It was not a story of grand gestures or dramatic phrases. It was an intimacy built from small things. The way Walter always set out Agnes's coffee mug in the morning, knowing she liked the wide ceramic one, not the narrow glass. The habit Agnes had of tucking a sprig of rosemary into his shirt pocket when he headed out for a hard day. For luck, she'd say, and Walter carried it without irony. The way they sat on the back porch, after supper each night, sometimes saying nothing for half an hour, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the wind in the spruce and the distant call of loons on the lake several miles away. It was a private language that took decades to build and needed no translation. The family's assets were the result of decades of disciplined work. Beyond the house on Maple Avenue, built piece by piece and paid off in full, there was a modest savings account Walter maintained at the local bank, a small parcel of land at the back of their property he had purchased in 1993 from a neighbor who needed quick cash, and an old but reliable truck Walter used for occasional hauling jobs after he retired from construction. And there was the property by Lake Superior. But that was Walter's secret. A secret Agnes would only begin to understand many years later. Walter traveled to the lake region twice a year, sometimes 3 times, always for 2 or 3 days. Agnes never knew exactly what he did there. He said he went to look after some property of his father's, to resolve some old inheritance paperwork, boring bureaucratic business that never seemed to end. Agnes never questioned it deeply. There was in Walter an honesty so fundamental to his personality that she simply did not distrust him. And there was also, she realized afterward, a careful discretion in him, a way of sharing without revealing, of telling the truth without telling everything. Once, in 2001, Agnes found a brown envelope in the desk drawer with the name of the lake region written in the corner. She was about to open it, but Walter entered the room at that exact moment, saw the envelope in her hands, and with a naturalness that held no urgency said, "It's what I told you. The business with my father's property. Bureaucratic stuff. Don't worry about that, Agnes." She put the envelope back, not because he asked her to, but because there was in Walter something, a tenderness toward her, that was more eloquent than any explanation. It would be 15 years before she understood what had been inside that envelope. Daniel grew up, went to the State University in Minneapolis, graduated with a degree in business administration to Agnes's great pride, returned from Minneapolis with a job at a regional bank, and brought home a woman whose name Agnes heard for the first time in a phone call. Christine Adler, a marketing manager from a well-off family in downtown Minneapolis. "Very different from us, Mom," Daniel said on that same call, in a tone Agnes would only identify later as a warning. At the time, she took it as affection. They met Christine one Sunday in October of 2009 when Daniel brought her to Birchwood for the first time. She arrived in Daniel's car. Straight dark hair, tailored blazer, heeled boots that sank slightly into the gravel of the backyard. She was pretty, articulate, and knew exactly how to act in every situation, which is a quality when it's natural and a tool when it's calculated. With Walter, Christine was respectful and composed. With Agnes, she was sweet in a way that had the texture of artificial sugar, correct in form, a little empty underneath. Agnes made wild rice soup, fresh bread, and a blueberry cake that had been her mother Britta's recipe. Christine ate little, saying she was watching her diet, and spent a good part of the afternoon on her phone. As she was leaving, she said she had absolutely loved everything, that the food was delicious and so homemade, and that she hoped to come back many more times. That night, Walter and Agnes sat on the back porch as always. They were quiet for a while. Then Walter said slowly, "That woman is smart." Agnes said, "Yes." They stayed quiet a little longer. "Smart in a way that makes you tired," said Walter. Agnes didn't answer, but she took his hand. They married in June of 2011 in Minneapolis in a ceremony at a hotel ballroom that Agnes imagined must have cost more than her first year's salary as a substitute teacher. She wore a navy blue dress she had bought in a shop in Duluth, hair pinned up, the pearl earrings Walter had given her on their 30th wedding anniversary. In the official wedding photo taken at the end of the night, Christine stands at the center, smiling at the camera, and Agnes is slightly outside the frame, as if the photographer had forgotten to adjust the angle. Daniel and Christine went to live in Minneapolis. They came to Birchwood for some occasions, Christmas, Walter's birthday, but with an irregularity that grew with time. Agnes noted the absences but said nothing. Walter noticed and said even less. There was in them, during that period, a small and quiet sadness that neither of them wanted to feed with too much attention. In 2013, Walter had his first heart attack. Mild, said the doctor, but enough to leave marks on the heart muscle and change the pace at which Walter moved through the world. He gave up the hauling jobs, reduced his outings, stayed home more. The trips to the Lake Superior region, which had already become less frequent, stopped altogether. Agnes cared for him with the same naturalness with which she had done everything in her life, without drama, without self-pity, with steady hands and constant presence. She got up early to prepare the low-sodium breakfast the doctor had prescribed. She kept track of his medications in a small notebook. She drove him to his monthly checkups 2 hours away in Duluth. Daniel came to Birchwood when his father had the heart attack. He stayed 4 days. Christine did not come. An important presentation she couldn't reschedule. During his 4 days, Daniel slept in the front bedroom, went out rarely, spent most of his time on his phone. One afternoon he sat with his father in the living room, and they talked for an hour with the door closed. Agnes was in the kitchen and didn't try to listen, but she noticed that when the conversation ended, Walter was quieter than before, and Daniel avoided his mother's eyes at dinner. In the years that followed, Walter had 2 more minor heart episodes. The doctor was explicit the 3rd time. The heart was tired. There was no telling when. Walter received that information with the same quiet serenity with which he had lived everything. He began spending more time in the yard. He would sit for hours tending the wild strawberry patch along the fence, talking to the plants in a low voice, when he thought no one was listening. Once Agnes saw him from the window doing this and stopped without going in, feeling something that was not sadness and not joy, but had the quality of both. It was during those years, between 2015 and 2017, that Walter began doing several things Agnes would only understand later. He asked her to go to the county clerk's office to update some old documents on the house. Just a formality. It needs your signature. He spent an entire afternoon at a law office in Duluth with an attorney named Mr. Larson whom Agnes had never met. He made one last short trip to the Lake Superior region, only 2 days, from which he returned quieter than before, but with a look she couldn't quite describe. Settled, perhaps, like someone who has finished something important. One December evening of 2017, sitting on the back porch in the mild air, Walter reached into his shirt pocket and took out a small wooden box, the size of a deck of cards, and placed it in Agnes's hands, without saying anything. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was a rusted key attached to a strip of leather with a simple knot. "It's the key to the property by the lake," he said. "My father's, which is now mine, which is now yours." Agnes looked at the key, then at him. "Walter, I don't understand." "You don't need to understand right now." He closed her hands around the box, with a gentleness she felt in her bones. "Keep this key, Agnes. One day you're going to need it." She wanted to ask more, but there was something in the way he said it, without urgency, without drama, simply certain, that stopped her. She put the box in the bottom drawer of the nightstand beside the bed and never spoke of it again. Walter Whitmore died in March of 2018. A Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the yard chair beside the wild strawberry patch, which had already begun to show its first spring leaves. His heart stopped without warning, without apparent pain, without drama. When Agnes came out of the kitchen to call him for his afternoon coffee, he was sitting, with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the spruce tree in the corner, and he looked as though he was simply resting. He was 68 years old. They had been married 48 years. Agnes stood in the doorway for a time she could not measure. Then she went to him slowly, sat at his side, took the hand that was still warm, and stayed there, with him a little longer, before calling the neighbor, before calling Daniel, before letting the world in. Just the two of them. One last time. Walter's visitation was held in the living room of the house on Maple Avenue, as was the custom for someone who had lived his whole life in the same place. Neighbors came, friends of decades, people from the church, the owner of the hardware store where Walter had bought supplies for 40 years. Eyes red. Agnes stayed in the living room the whole time, dressed in black, receiving hugs from people whose faces she could barely bring into focus. Daniel arrived from Minneapolis with Christine 6 hours after Agnes had called with the news. When they walked in the door, Christine hugged Agnes briefly and said, "It was so quick. At least he didn't suffer." The correct words, said with the certainty of someone sure those were the correct words. Daniel held his mother longer, and Agnes felt that embraced something that might have been guilt, or might have only been grief. In that moment, she gave him every benefit of every doubt. Because she was burying the man she had slept beside for 48 years. And she had no room for any further analysis. The burial was the next day, a simple casket of light pine, as Walter had once requested in a conversation years before. The pastor spoke about a life of quiet work, about men who build without needing applause. Agnes listened with her hands folded in her lap, and a white handkerchief she did not let go of during the entire ceremony. At the edge of the grave, as the earth began to cover the casket, she felt something descending through the center of her chest that was not sadness and not pain, but absence. Palpable, concrete, as though a structure that had held everything up for decades had suddenly been removed, and she was learning to stand in a new way. That night, after the last neighbors had gone, and Daniel and Christine had retired to the front bedroom, Agnes sat on the back porch alone. The wild strawberry patch was just beginning its spring growth. The air smelled of damp earth and spruce resin. She stayed there for hours doing nothing, only listening to the silence, where Walter's presence used to be. The days that followed were that kind of practical numbness that death imposes. Document inventory, trips to the county clerk's office, calls to the bank, sympathy cards arriving by mail. Daniel and Christine stayed a week. On the surface, it all looked like family solidarity. But Agnes began to notice things that individually could be explained, but together formed a pattern. Christine asked to see the family documents, just to help organize things, she said with the smile she used for everything. Agnes went to find the folder Walter kept organized in his desk, and Christine held the papers in her hands for too long, going through them with an attention that was not the attention of someone helping, but of someone assessing. Daniel went one afternoon to his father's desk, a small room at the back of the house, where Walter kept documents and tools, and stayed there nearly 2 hours, with the door ajar. When he came out, he didn't mention what he had been looking for. That night, after everyone was asleep, Agnes went to the desk and noticed that the bottom drawer had been moved. The papers were in a slightly different order, lightly rearranged. On the second to last day of the week, Daniel sat with his mother at the kitchen table after dinner. Christine remained standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a positioning Agnes registered as strategic presence, there to listen, not to participate. Daniel said with all the studied gentleness he had learned somewhere, "Mom, we need to talk about the house." Agnes folded her hands on the table. "About what?" "About the future. You live here alone. It's a big house now. We have to think." "I've been living here for 40 years, Daniel. I know how to live here." "That's not it." He exhaled. "There are questions of estate succession. The house is part of the estate. Technically. Technically, the house is in your father's name, and mine," said Agnes, with a firmness that surprised even her. "Walter explained it to me." There was a pause. Christine in the doorway uncrossed her arms and crossed them again. "There are some things that need to be verified," said Daniel. "The attorney will look it over." "Which attorney?" "One we hired." Agnes looked at her son, then looked at Christine, who held her gaze for a second before looking away. Agnes stood up from the table, went to the sink, washed her mug, and said without turning around, "Fine. Let me know what the attorney says." That night, for the first time since Walter died, she slept badly. In the 3 months following the burial, Daniel and Christine came back to Birchwood 4 times, more than they had visited in the previous 3 years combined. Each visit had a different agenda, checking on some things with the county office, discussing the succession, a small documentary loose in the attorney had identified. On each visit, there were new papers that needed Agnes's signature. She signed some, not all. There was one in particular that a man in a suit brought on one of those visits, presented as a simplified succession filing that Agnes refused to sign. The man in the suit explained it was just a formality. Agnes said she was going to show it to her own attorney first. The man in the suit said that wasn't necessary. Agnes said, "If it's not necessary, then it can wait." The man in the suit and Christine exchanged a very quick glance that Agnes pretended not to see. It was around this time that things inside the house began to change at an accelerating pace. Christine proposed moving to Birchwood for a few months to help her mother-in-law through this difficult period. Daniel had his work in Minneapolis and couldn't come, but Christine could. She had requested a leave of absence. Agnes accepted the proposal with a mixed feeling she herself couldn't quite name. In the first days, the cohabitation was civil. Christine cooked sometimes, did the grocery shopping, answered calls from the county office when Agnes wasn't around. But there was a growing discomfort, too small to name in each episode, too large when added up. The living room television was always on the channel Christine chose, even when Agnes was there. Visits from Agnes's friends, Mrs. Viola, Mrs. Hedberg, Mrs. Ingrid, who was still vigorous well into her 80s, began to find the door closed at unexpected hours, or Christine answering. "Miss Agnes is resting. Today isn't a good day." "But I wasn't resting," Agnes told Christine one afternoon. "I was in the kitchen." "You look tired," said Christine with an expression of someone being thoughtful. "I wanted to save you the trouble." Agnes looked at her daughter-in-law for a long second. "Viola and Ingrid are my friends. They come in here whenever they want." "Of course, Miss Agnes. I just wanted to help." But the following week, the same thing with Mrs. Hedberg. In November of 2018, 8 months after Walter's death, Christine announced she had decided to stay permanently in Birchwood, and that Daniel would transfer to a branch of the bank 3 hours away. It was news presented as an established fact, without consultation. "It just makes more sense this way," said Christine. "The house is big enough for everyone." "It is my house," said Agnes. "It's the family's house," said Christine sweetly. Daniel arrived at the end of November with boxes and new furniture. The front bedroom, which had been Agnes and Walter's bedroom for nearly 4 decades, which had the window facing the backyard and the wild strawberry patch and the porch chair where Walter had spent his last afternoon, was designated as the master bedroom for Daniel and Christine. "The back room is yours. It's quieter." Agnes stood in the doorway of her own bedroom for a moment. Then she said only fine and went to the back room with the bag she had packed before they asked her to. The back room was 12 by 10 feet. It had a barred window that faced the neighbor's fence, a ceiling fan that rattled on the second speed, and a double bed that had been the guest room when there were still guests. It was functional. It was adequate. But it was not hers. And the difference between a functional place and a place that is yours is one of the greatest distances that can exist within 4 walls. What followed was a calculated erosion. First, the living room. "Miss Agnes, we're having people over tonight. It would be better if you stayed in your room, wouldn't it?" It wasn't a question. Agnes went to her room. The next week, the same request. After a month, she had simply stopped going to the living room in the evenings because she had internalized that the space was no longer hers between 6 and 10 at night. Then the kitchen. Christine had the kitchen remodeled without telling Agnes. She arrived one morning with a contractor and said it was a surprise, an improvement for the house. The cabinets Agnes had chosen in 1979 were replaced. The blue tile, that had been Agnes's small luxury, savored at the hardware store in the city in the year they moved in, gone. In their place, white lacquered cabinets, stainless steel sink, smooth gray tile. Everything correct. Nothing familiar. I liked the blue tile, said Agnes, looking at the new wall. It was very old, Miss Agnes. This is easier to clean. Agnes looked at the gray wall for a moment. Who's going to be cleaning them? Christine didn't answer. The landline phone was disconnected. We only use cell phones now. No point paying for a landline. Agnes didn't have a cell phone. When she wanted to call someone, she had to ask Christine or Daniel. Christine lent it sometimes. Daniel wasn't always home. Mrs. Viola, who used to call every Sunday morning, stopped calling because the number no longer existed. Weeks went by without Agnes speaking to any of her friends. Agnes's pension was roughly $1,100 a month. Christine had offered, from the first months, to help manage the household finances because there are too many accounts for Miss Agnes to handle alone. Agnes had resisted at first, but one afternoon Christine arrived with an overdue utility bill, one she might have deliberately set aside, and presented it as proof that Agnes needed help. You don't need to worry about this. I'll handle everything. Just give me the card. Agnes gave her the card. Of the $1,100, she received $80 in cash each month. The rest goes to household expenses, said Christine. Agnes never saw any bill, any bank statement, any accounting. With $80 a month, Agnes bought what she needed for her room: soap, toothpaste, crackers she hid in the nightstand drawer because she had learned that anything left in the kitchen disappeared. Once she found Christine throwing out a jar of lingonberry preserves Mrs. Hedberg had brought as a gift. It had gone bad, said Christine. The jar was full and sealed. The visits stopped entirely in the second year. Christine had developed a system of filters that functioned with admirable consistency. She would check the intercom before opening the door and say that Miss Agnes was indisposed or had a doctor's appointment or simply that it wasn't a good time. Especially when there was persistence, as when Mrs. Ingrid came personally to knock at the door and stood on the sidewalk for 15 minutes. Christine answered and said Miss Agnes was asleep. Agnes was awake in the back room listening to Ingrid's voice, unable to call out because the room was too far back and her voice wouldn't carry. Daniel knew. There is no way an intelligent man can live in the same house as his mother and not know. There were moments when Agnes saw in her son's eyes something that was discomfort, a rapid shift of the gaze when she said something that implied what was happening, a sudden attention to his phone when the conversation neared any point of friction. There was one afternoon when Agnes found him alone in the kitchen and said directly, "Daniel, I'm your mother. Look at me." He looked. "Do you know what's happening here?" Silence. "I want you to tell me what's happening." Daniel stood up, went to the sink, turned the water on, stood there with water running over his hands for several seconds. Then he turned it off, dried his hands, and said without turning around, "Mom, you're exaggerating. Christine takes care of you. Christine is here." Christine barred me from my own living room. She didn't bar you. She asked. She didn't ask. She decided. There's a difference. Daniel turned around. On his face was an expression Agnes had seen before, when he was 16 and his father had looked at him in silence at the kitchen table. It was the expression of someone who knows exactly what they're doing wrong and has chosen to continue. "Mom, the house is big. Everyone has their space." "My space," said Agnes with a quiet that came from 48 years of practice, "is this entire house. I built this house. I paid for this house. I buried the man I shared this house with for 48 years. She paused. "Don't talk down to me." Daniel was silent. Then he said, "I know, Mom. I know." But nothing changed. That was in 2019. The following year, the pandemic began, and the confinement already imposed on Agnes in her back room gained a new argument. Public health. You can't have visitors. It's dangerous. You can't go out. You're in a high-risk group. The bars on the window facing the neighbor's fence became the only available view for months. It was during the pandemic that Agnes began writing in the notebook. A green notebook with hard covers bought. With part of her $80 in April of 2020 at the pharmacy she could still reach when Daniel went to the market and she asked to come along. She wrote at night, after the sounds of the house went quiet. She wrote about Walter, what his hands looked like when he was working, the way he said good morning, the way he stood in the yard looking at something only he could see. She wrote about her childhood, about her mother Britta, about school, about the years building the house on Maple Avenue. Sometimes she wrote only about the day, what she had eaten, the sound the fan made, the quality of the light through the barred window at different times of day. It was the only space that still belonged entirely to her. In 2021, Daniel found the notebook. Not because Agnes showed it to him. She had kept it under the bed inside a shoe box wrapped in a plastic bag. But Christine cleaned the back room regularly. So it doesn't collect dust, Miss Agnes. It's for your health. And during one of those cleanings, the notebook disappeared. When Agnes noticed, she went to the kitchen, where Christine was, and asked about the notebook. Christine said she hadn't seen any notebook. Agnes said she was certain where she had kept it. Christine said, sometimes we don't remember where we put things, Miss Agnes. Your memory. Agnes stopped searching for the notebook in front of Christine. But that night she did not sleep. The medical visit that shifted the tone of everything happened in February of 2022. Daniel and Christine took Agnes to a neurologist in Duluth, a doctor Agnes had never seen before, whose name she didn't know. The appointment lasted 45 minutes during which Christine answered most of the questions about Agnes's habits and daily routine, while Agnes sat beside her trying to interject. When they left, the doctor had issued a report describing early signs of cognitive decline and the need for daily supervision. Agnes had never received any such diagnosis in her life. When they arrived home, Christine said sweetly, softly, as always, that the report was only a precaution for Miss Agnes's own protection. Daniel sat in the car for several minutes after they arrived, before coming inside. When he came in, he went straight to his room. He didn't look at his mother. That night, Agnes lay awake until very late. Not writing. She no longer had the notebook. Simply on her back, with her eyes open, listening to the fan, thinking. It was then that she remembered the box. She hadn't thought of it in months, perhaps more than a year. It was in the nightstand drawer, right side, where she had put it the night Walter gave it to her. She reached out in the dark, opened the drawer slowly, ran her fingers along the bottom, felt the smooth wood of the little box, took it out, opened it. The rusted key was there. Same strip of leather, same simple knot. Agnes held the key in her right hand in the darkness for a long while and heard it, as clearly as if he were in the same room. Walter's voice. Keep this key, Agnes. One day you're going to need it. That day had come. In the 3 days that followed, Agnes did something she had not done in years. She planned. With the quiet precision of someone who had spent decades organizing a household, managing a family, surviving the absence and presence of the people she loved. She planned each step the way one plans a construction project, brick by brick, without haste, without room for error. She knew there was an ID card in a folder at the back of the closet that Christine had not discovered, tucked inside an envelope glued behind the closet mirror, which Agnes had placed there 2 years earlier, as an intuitive precaution she herself couldn't have explained at the time. She knew that the following Friday Daniel would leave early for a meeting in the city, and Christine would go to the salon at 9:30 in the morning. That was the routine of months. She knew a bus to Duluth left from the Birchwood Depot at 6:15 in the morning with a connection to the Lake Superior region. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had received a promise from someone who never lied, that the key in her hand led somewhere Walter had prepared. Thursday night, Agnes did not sleep. Not from anxiety, from calculation. At 3 in the morning, she quietly organized what she would take. The ID, the key, $83 she had saved over the last 3 months, hoarding coins in a sock at the bottom of her drawer, a change of clothes in a plastic bag, the wedding ring she still wore, and a photograph of Walter taken one summer in the early 90s, him standing in the yard, with the spruce tree behind him, squinting a little against the sun, smiling the way he smiled when he didn't know someone was looking. At 4:30 in the morning on a Friday in March of 2022, Agnes opened the window of the back room. She had noticed weeks earlier, with newly strategic eyes, that the bars were ornamental, not structural, held only at the top, with no concrete at the base. With a firm, careful pull they gave, with a low sound she muffled, with the weight of her own body pressed against them. She went through the yard, passed by the wild strawberry patch, stopped 2 seconds, pressed her hand to the cold earth above the roots. Did not cry. Opened the side gate, with a key she had taken from the kitchen key rack weeks earlier and kept at the bottom of her coat pocket. She walked along the empty street at a normal pace, not hurried, because a person who runs draws attention. 2 blocks away, her neighbor, Mrs. Viola, the only person she had said goodbye to, through a note slipped under her door 3 days before, had left an envelope tucked into the mailbox. Inside, $35 more, and a note in small, careful handwriting. Go, Agnes. God is walking with you. Don't look back. I love you. At the bus depot at 5:45, second in line, with $118 in her pocket, a rusted key, a change of clothes, and a photograph of her dead husband, Agnes Whitmore boarded the first bus of the morning. Behind her, the house on Maple Avenue slept. And inside it, no one awake had noticed she was gone. The trip from Birchwood to the Lake Superior region is not short. Nearly 7 hours by bus, counting the connections, one in Duluth and another in a smaller junction town, with nearly a 2-hour wait at the Duluth terminal, where Agnes sat on a green plastic bench, eating half a cracker she had kept in her pocket, watching people come and go. No one looked at her. A 73-year-old woman, with a plastic bag and a worn blue cardigan, is invisible at a bus terminal in the American interior, and Agnes let the invisibility protect her. Through the bus window, the landscape changed in successive stages. First, the flat farmland around Birchwood, with its fields still carrying the last gray patches of late winter snow in the shadowed hollows. Then, as the bus moved north and east, the terrain slowly thickening, the rivers appearing, the forest deepening. Then the beginning of the Lake Superior country, that singular landscape, where dense boreal forest and ancient rock and the largest freshwater lake in the world creates something that doesn't quite feel like it belongs to ordinary geography. Agnes looked out the window for nearly the entire journey, her chin resting lightly on the glass, watching how the world became different with every mile. She thought about Walter for most of the trip. She thought about the trips he had made to the lake twice a year for decades. She thought about the attorney in Duluth, Mr. Larson, whose existence she had forgotten until now. She thought about the neurological report Christine had arranged. She thought about how her handwriting was still steady, her memory still clear, her thoughts still organized, with the same precision as always. She thought about Daniel. About the boy with the red bicycle. About the genuine embrace of childhood. About the adult who looked away when he should have looked forward. She tried to find anger and found mostly sadness, and she let the sadness pass out the window along with the landscape. At the second connection, a woman in her 40s sat beside her with a small boy in her lap. The boy looked at Agnes with the unfiltered curiosity of children and said, "Are you somebody's grandma?" Agnes looked at the boy for a moment. Then she said, "I am. But today I'm only my own grandma." The boy didn't understand the phrase, but the boy's mother, who had heard it, glanced at Agnes with a recognition that needed no words. The last stretch of the journey followed the lake shore for a good part of the route. It was late afternoon when the bus began that stretch, and the light of the sun on the water, a deep cold gold, making the surface look like hammered metal, was the kind of thing that demands silence. Agnes looked at Lake Superior for a long while. Walter had grown up on its shores. He had fished those waters, learned to read the weather by the behavior of the mergansers and the common loons along those banks. A part of what formed Walter was in that landscape, and she was arriving at it at 73 for the first time, as if she were finally meeting a part of the man she had loved for decades, that she had never quite been introduced to. The lake region smelled of cold, fresh water and balsam fir when the bus arrived at 5:30 in the evening, the sky dark and the first stars already appearing over the tree line. The small port town that received her had at that hour the quiet of northern lake towns after the end of the working day. Fishing boats tied to the dock, the smell of wood smoke from houses already lit for the evening, children being called in from backyards. Agnes got off the bus with her plastic bag, the key in her pocket, her wedding ring on her finger. She stopped on the sidewalk outside the small terminal, looking at the street before her. She had $64 left. She had made no reservation. She had no specific address beyond what the key indicated. She had left a cage and arrived at the edge of the unknown. And the unknown had stars and smelled of pine and bore the name of a place the man she had loved had frequented for decades, without explaining why. She found a bench outside the terminal and sat down. She opened the little box, took out the key, looked at it in the light of the street lamp. Rusted, heavy for its size, with a number engraved in the metal. 8. Only the number 8. A man who was closing up the bait and tackle shop nearby saw her and came over. He asked if she was all right. She said yes. He asked if she was waiting for someone. She said she was looking for a property that had belonged to a family named Whitmore near the lake, with a lock numbered 8. The man was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Whitmore property, Walter's? The one out along the North Trail past the old fish campsite?" Agnes looked at him. "Walter was my husband." The man was quiet again, with a different quality of silence. Then he said, "Well then, we didn't know exactly when, but we always figured somebody would show up one day with that key." The man was named Eli. Eli Saarinen, 65 years old, born in that lake town, the son of a commercial fisherman, as Walter's father had been. He had a face weathered by the lake wind, and the kind of measured, unhurried way of speaking that seemed characteristic of people who live on the shores of very large bodies of water, as if time in those places moved to a different rhythm. "I knew old Mr. Whitmore Sr. since I was a kid," said Eli, setting the closed sign in his shop window and sitting on the bench beside Agnes without ceremony. "He fished the same stretch of shore as my father. After Mr. Sr. passed, Walter would come around sometimes. We'd see him on the dock, say hello." He paused. Walter was quiet, the kind who does a lot and says little. Said Agnes. "Yes. I knew the property was his. After he stopped coming, I figured something had happened." He looked at the key in Agnes's hand. "But he left you the key." "He left me the key." Eli was quiet for a moment, looking at the street in front of them. Then he said, "Do you have a place to sleep tonight?" Agnes said she didn't. "Then my wife is going to be very happy to have company." There was no negotiation in the offer. It came from someone who still practiced hospitality as a natural language, not as a performance. Agnes looked at this man she had never seen in her life, who was inviting her into his home without hesitation, and she felt something that took a moment to identify. It was the sensation of being seen without suspicion. After years in a house where every look had an agenda, a look without an agenda felt almost physical in its difference. "I accept," she said. Eli's wife was named Marta. Marta Saarinen, 62 years old, small and energetic, with silver hair worn in a practical braid, and the warm directness of someone for whom kindness is not a performance, but simply the way things are done. She received Agnes at the door of their small house near the water, with a hug Agnes hadn't expected and couldn't step back from. Marta was one of those people who hug as if they're making a declaration. "I know who you are," said Marta, holding Agnes by the shoulders after the hug and looking at her face with careful attention. "Walter talked about you every time he came through here. Every single time." Agnes stood still. "Walter talked about me." "He did." Marta pulled her inside. "Come, there's fish chowder and fresh bread, and we have a great deal to tell you." That night, sitting at Marta and Eli's kitchen table, with a bowl of thick chowder and a glass of warm apple cider, Agnes heard things about Walter she hadn't known. That he had first come to the Lake Superior property in 1983, after his father passed and left it as his only real inheritance. That he had stayed a week, that first time, in silence, reorganizing the place the way someone does when they're making a decision that doesn't yet have a name. That he had returned regularly ever since, not just for maintenance, but to think. He said it was the only place in the world where his mind went completely quiet, said Eli. No noise in his head, just the lake. "He always spoke of you," said Marta. "Every visit, he'd sit at this table and drink coffee and talk about Agnes, what she was doing, what she had built, how she kept everything running. He said you were the strongest person he had ever known and that you didn't know it." Agnes listened to all of this with her hands around her glass. Eyes lowered, with an expression that was neither sadness nor joy, but the quality of someone receiving something that took a very long time to arrive. When Marta finished speaking, Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He never told me any of this." "No," said Marta, "but he wanted you to know it at the right moment." Agnes slept in Eli and Marta's guest room, with the deep and restorative sleep that only comes after real exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of the body, but of constant vigilance, of years of sleeping with one ear alert. For the first time in years, she didn't wake at the slightest sound of the house. She didn't lie there calculating what the silence meant. She didn't wait for a tray. She simply slept. On a mattress that smelled of clean cotton, with the window open to the backyard, and the distant sound of Lake Superior arriving in soft waves through the early morning air. She woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of Marta in the kitchen. After the coffee, strong, sweetened with a little honey, served with warm rye bread, that Agnes ate slowly, like someone who has all the time in the world, Eli said he would take her to the property. "It's a bit of a walk along the North Trail," he said, "but you look like someone who walks fine." "Walking is the one thing they haven't taken from me yet," said Agnes. They set out at 7:30 in the morning. The March sun came in low and clear, with that particular northern quality that makes every detail of the landscape sharp. The fishing boats tied to the dock with their thick ropes, the dense spruce and balsam fir along the shore trail, the still dark water of the lake, with its particular color, somewhere between slate and deep blue, shifting with the angle of the light. Agnes walked beside Eli in silence for the first stretch, feeling the packed earth trail underfoot, listening to the lake. There was a quality in that landscape, the combination of the vast still water, the towering old-growth forest, the cloudless sky, the air that smelled of cold water and cold stone and cold clean things, that made it difficult to maintain any complicated emotional state. It wasn't that the pain went away. It was that there was something larger than the pain in that setting, and the pain was temporarily put in perspective. "Is it far?" asked Agnes after about 15 minutes. "Maybe 10 more," said Eli. "The property is around a bend past the old fish camp foundation. Bit isolated. Good for thinking. Not much else. Which is why old Mr. Whitmore Sr. chose it. He was a man of little noise." "Sounds like his son," said Agnes. Eli let out a short, genuine laugh. "Sure does." The trail narrowed past the old fish camp, barely more than a concrete foundation half hidden in the undergrowth, and then opened onto an extraordinary overlook, a high point of firm ground, with a view of Lake Superior stretching to the horizon in both directions, the water shifting from dark green near the rocky shore to deep blue at the center, and the sky above, so vast and clear it was almost vertiginous. Agnes stopped there involuntarily. She looked at the lake and was without words for several seconds. "You've never been here before?" said Eli. "Never." "And what do you think?" Agnes looked at the horizon, the dark tree line on the far shore barely visible, the light on the water. "I think," she said slowly, "I understand why he came here to think." The trail after the overlook descended gently through a stand of old birch trees, white bark gleaming in the morning light, and then curved around a rocky outcrop. And rounding that curve, Agnes saw the property for the first time. She stopped. There was no way not to stop. It was a structure that resisted easy description because it combined so many things at once: abandonment and solidity, neglect and intention. The construction was of dark weathered cedar, aged by decades of lake wind and freeze-thaw cycles to the color of driftwood. Solid, dry, the kind of wood that survives because it was chosen to survive. The roof was of old cedar shake, thick and layered, in the style of traditional lake country outbuildings. Moss had taken hold at the north edge, but the structure beneath was sound. There were climbing vines over the left wall, not the wild growth of a truly abandoned place, but something half-guided, as if someone had periodically trained the stems, without cutting them, letting them cover the wall in a pattern that was both natural and intentional. The entrance gate was of heavy planks, with a hasp and a padlock. The number 8 padlock, rusted like the key that matched it, thick and heavy, chosen to last. All around the property, the grounds extended in directions Agnes couldn't yet fully measure. There was vegetation everywhere, native birch, spruce, cedar, serviceberry, but there was clearly also an expanse that went well beyond the main structure. A field of sorts, open land between the forest and the lake shore, whose end she couldn't see from here. "How much land is this?" asked Agnes without taking her eyes off it. Eli was quiet for a moment. "I'm not certain exactly," he said, "but it's a good amount." He paused. "A real good amount." Agnes looked at the property for a long moment. There was in her, she would understand this afterward, remembering the moment, a quality of recognition, not of a place she had seen before, but of a place that was, in some way she could not rationally explain, hers, as if the place already knew her, and she was only arriving to confirm it. She walked to the gate. The key entered the padlock's keyhole with an initial resistance, rusted metal pushing back years of being locked, and then gave, with a click. The most satisfying sound Agnes had heard in a long time. The padlock opened, the gate swung inward, and she entered. The first thing she noticed inside the yard was the smell. A complex smell that took a moment to separate. Old cedar warmed by the morning sun, the mineral cold of the lake nearby, and a faint sweetness she didn't immediately identify, but would later discover was serviceberry fruit, ripening on a tree leaning against the south wall. The yard was packed earth, with a wooden bench against the right wall, and a simple rack at the back that still held 2 large hooks, where fishing nets had probably hung for decades. A wild apple tree had grown in the left corner, generous and green, even in early spring, its buds just beginning to swell. The main door of the structure was of solid planked wood, with a cast iron ring latch. Agnes put her hand on the latch and pushed slowly. The door opened. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested. Light entered through 2 sets of wooden shutter windows on the side walls, which stood open. The air circulated freely from one side to the other, carrying with it the smell of the lake. The floor was wide plank cedar, dark with age, marks of use in time but no rot, chosen by someone who understood construction. To the left of the entrance was a space that had been a kitchen, a small wood stove with a flat cooking surface. A wide wooden work counter, shelves nailed to the wall, with a few items carefully placed. A black clay pot, 2 white enamel plates with blue rims, a thick glass jar, a sealed tin of coffee. The objects had a thin layer of dust, but were not deteriorated, preserved with the specific care of someone who knew that one day someone would come to use them. To the right was a sleeping space, a wooden bed frame with a slatted platform, a rolled sleeping mat folded beside it, a faded wool blanket coiled in a corner on a low shelf. And on that shelf, near the bed, a set of objects that Agnes identified as personal before she could identify whose they were. A dark leather wallet, thin, worn at the corners. A small folding knife in a leather sheath. A desk calendar opened to December 2017. December 2017. 2 months before Walter had given her the key on the back porch. In the center of the structure, on a solid 4-plank table, sat a clay vessel with a fitted lid. And under the table, wedged between 2 of the legs in a way you couldn't see standing, only by crouching, was a dark wooden box with a leather strap handle. The chest. Agnes looked at the box for a long while without touching it. Eli, who had come in behind her and had been standing near the door in silence, said, "Do you want me to wait outside?" "No," said Agnes. "Stay?" She pulled out the chair, sat at the table, then leaned down and pulled the chest by its leather strap. It was heavy, the specific weight of papers, dense and quiet. She set it on the table. There was no lock, only a wooden sliding latch that she opened with a gentle push. Inside, the contents were organized with the discipline she had learned to recognize as Walter's discipline. Everything in its place, every paper in its own folder. There were transparent plastic folders fastened with rubber bands, 3 of them, each with a handwritten paper label. And on top of everything was a plain white envelope with a single word written on the front. In Walter's large, slightly slanted handwriting. Agnes. She looked at her own name for a moment. That seemed long. Then she picked up the envelope, opened it slowly with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from that physical anticipation the body has when it is about to receive something that will change everything. Inside were several sheets of bond paper folded in thirds, covered on both sides, with the same large slanted handwriting, denser and more intimate than the name on the envelope. She began to read. Agnes, if you're reading this, one of 2 things has happened. The first is that you found this after I was gone, and you are well, you are free, and you are where I always wanted you to be. The second is that what I feared happened, and Daniel and Christine did what I always knew they were capable of doing. I pray it's the first. But if it's the second, I need you to know that what happened was not for lack of my care. It was for lack of my courage. And I'm going to ask your forgiveness for that lack of courage to the last page of this letter. Let me start at the beginning. This property dates to 1949. My father, Gunnar Whitmore, built the main structure with his own hands the year he and my mother were married. He was a fisherman, as you know, but he was also a man who understood land the way he understood water. He knew where the soil was right, where the water was clean, where the ground holds what you plant in it. When he chose this property on the northern shore of Lake Superior, everyone thought he was a simple man choosing a simple place to fish. He was, but he was also a man who knew, with the instinct of someone who had spent his whole life on that water, that this land was special. What no one knew, what even I didn't know when he died in 1980 and left me the property, is that this shoreline would fall within the expansion zone of what would later become a federally protected environmental area. When I understood this, in the late 1990s, when conversations about the Great Lakes Conservation Program began appearing in the news and federal land surveys were being conducted, I went to see an attorney in Duluth, a man named Mr. Larson, recommended to me as honest and careful, the 2 rarest things in an attorney. Mr. Larson spent 3 months studying the situation. And what he told me in a quiet office in downtown Duluth changed my understanding of everything. The land my father left me, which is now mine, which is now yours, measures 17 acres and 300 square feet measured on the original federal survey from 1968. Of those 17 acres, 12 acres and approximately 90 square feet fall within the protected buffer zone of the Federal Conservation Area, in the category of protected environmental land, with sustainable use designation. That means the land cannot be commercially developed, but it also means the land generates, through the Federal Conservation Reserve Program, environmental credits calculated annually based on the preserved acreage and the protection zone classification. Mr. Larson was very clear about the numbers. In the estimate, from 2017, when we updated the calculation, the annual credits generated by the property are valued between $540,000 and $590,000 per year, depending on carbon market rates and program revisions. There is a trust fund that Mr. Larson has been managing in your name since 2015. That fund is untouchable until you sign the activation documents. Mr. Larson has all the contact information at his office in Duluth. The phone number and address are in the blue folder inside the chest labeled Legal Documents. But that's not all. And I need you to read what follows very carefully, because this is about Daniel. I know what the boy is. I knew it since that afternoon in the kitchen when he was 16, and I looked him in the eyes and saw what was there. He wasn't evil, not the kind that comes from the heart. It was a weakness, which is sometimes worse. The weakness of someone who always takes the easier road, even when that road costs someone else. And I, who should have corrected, that when he was still young enough to be corrected, chose not to see. Out of love, out of cowardice, because I didn't want you to be hurt. And the result was that you were hurt anyway, only later and deeper. Forgive me, Agnes. In 2015, when I began to notice that Daniel was asking questions about the estate, not the questions of a concerned son, but of an heir calculating, I went to Mr. Larson and asked him to do one specific thing. I asked him to verify the title of the house on Maple Avenue. What Mr. Larson found is going to hurt you, and it is going to strengthen you. The house on Maple Avenue has always been in your name, Agnes. Since 1979, when we bought it, the deed was signed in the name of Agnes Louise Whitmore. I did this on purpose from the very first day, because I knew, not with anger, not with suspicion, but with the knowledge of someone who knows his own son, that there was a possibility that one day he would try to do something with that property that none of us should tolerate. What Mr. Larson found in 2016 was that Daniel had hired a notary broker to alter the ownership record of the house on Maple Avenue. The alteration is technically fraudulent, carried out with forged documents in which your signature was reproduced without your knowledge or consent. Mr. Larson has a copy of the original 1979 deed and the fraudulent alteration. He also has the name of the broker and the date the transaction was made. In the green folder inside the chest, labeled House Maple Avenue, you will find all the documents and Mr. Larson's report. That is sufficient grounds for a lawsuit to void the fraudulent legal act, as well as criminal proceedings for falsification of a public document. Mr. Larson is waiting for your call. Agnes, I want to tell you something I never said out loud. Because I am one of those men who does and doesn't speak. You were the best part of everything I lived. Not the best part of the marriage, the best part of everything, of every morning waking up, of every board I ever laid, of every trip I took in this life, of every thought I had when things got hard. The reason I came to this lake property twice a year all those years was not just for the maintenance. It was because this place reminded me why I worked, why I saved, why I planned. I would sit on the shore with my feet on the rocks and think, this is for Agnes. This land, this trust, this protection, all of it is for Agnes. I should have brought you here earlier. I should have told you earlier. I should have put you in the truck and shown you the lake and the shore and the way the ice formations build on the rocks in January, enormous and crystalline, the most beautiful thing I ever saw in 68 years. I should have done it 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But I kept putting it off because I thought it would frighten you. Because I thought you'd want me to stop keeping secrets. Because I thought it would be easier to explain everything at once when the moment came. The moment came. This place is yours, Agnes. Every acre, every birch tree, every rocky shore, every environmental credit, every cent of the trust, every line of the deed. This is what 48 years of love accumulates when a man, who is not good with words, is very good with acts. I love you, Agnes Louise Teller Whitmore. I loved you since that community dance with the green bandstand. I will keep loving you from wherever I am. I never forgot you. I never would. Forever yours, Walter. P.S. In the yellow folder inside the chest, you'll find the deed to the property, plus Mr. Larson's complete contact information. He is honest. You can trust him. He knows you are going to come one day, and he is waiting. P.P.S. The serviceberry tree on the south wall gives fruit in late June. It's sweet. I always ate it standing right at the tree. You'll like it. Agnes read the letter from beginning to end without stopping. Then she folded it in her lap, crossed her hands over it, and was quiet for a good while. Eli, who had remained standing near the door the entire time, said nothing. Marta, who had arrived silently at some point during the reading and was now sitting on the bench outside the open door, also said nothing. The lake murmured. Birds sang in the birch trees. The morning light came through the slatted windows in oblique bands that crossed the table and the chest, and Agnes's hands holding the letter. Then came the crying. Not all at once. It came in waves. First her eyes filled, and she stayed there, vision blurred, still quiet. Then her breathing changed rhythm, a sob that came from the center of her chest, and then it was everything. All the tears of 3 years in a confined back room. All the trays, all the $80, all the nights with the rattling fan, all of Daniel's eyes turning away, all the mornings without the herb garden, all the afternoons without the wild strawberry patch, all the ungrieved mourning of Walter in the middle of the oppression. All of it came out at once, with the force and violence and relief of a river finally reaching the sea, with the sound of someone who is at last in a place where they can fall without anyone using the fall against them. Marta entered the structure without being called, sat beside Agnes, put her arm around her shoulders without saying anything. Eli turned toward the window. The crying lasted a long time. And when it ended, when the last wave passed, and what remained was only the clean exhaustion of someone who has emptied something that had been accumulating too long, Agnes sat, with her back against the chair, eyes red, the letter still in her lap, and felt something she had forgotten existed. Peace. Not the peace of surrender. The peace of someone who has arrived. After a few minutes of silence, she opened the folders. The green folder with the Maple Avenue documents. The original 1979 deed, with the name Agnes Louise Whitmore printed in formal type, and Mr. Larson's 9-page report detailing the forgery, with a copy of the altered document, the name of the broker, the date, the chain of operations. The blue folder with the legal documents for the property and the trust, including the most recent environmental credits assessment. $574,000 annually. Reference, October 2021. A number, $574,000 per year, generated by 17 acres of land that everyone had believed was a forgotten fisherman's outbuilding by a lake. The yellow folder, with the deed to the property in the name of Walter Gunnar Whitmore, with a 2017 notarized transfer signed by Mr. Larson conveying the title to Agnes Louise Whitmore in accordance with the declaration of the original owner. Agnes ran her fingertips over the paper of the transfer document. Her name, in blue notary ink. Agnes Louise Whitmore. Eli, she said. He turned. Do you know what's in this folder? She lifted the blue folder slightly. He looked at it. Walter told me once, on one of those visits, that this land was worth more than it looked. More than it looked, she repeated, with a tone that had something between laughter and reverence. Do you know what the annual environmental credits for this property are worth? He was quiet. $574,000 a year. The silence that settled had a different quality from all the previous silences. Marta closed her eyes for a second, as if processing a number larger than expected. Eli looked at Agnes with a slow nod. Lord, said Marta quietly. My Walter, said Agnes. And then she let out a short, surprised, genuine laugh. The first real laugh she had given in years. A laugh that started in the chest and rose. The laugh of someone who had been loved in a way that took decades to fully understand, and now understood. She spent the rest of the morning opening the chest completely. Besides the 3 folders, there were other items. A black-covered notebook that had been Gunnar's journal, Walter's father, with entries from 1952 to 1978, describing the life of a Lake Superior fisherman with an ingenuous, precise detail that was in itself a historical document. A set of old black and white photographs, yellowed at the edges, showing the lake shore in the 1950s and 1960s. Photographs which in their state of preservation were probably rare. A hand-drawn map of the property made by Gunnar himself, with annotations about the fishing points, current lines, and seasonal ice formations. And at the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in a piece of green wool cloth, a gold chain, with a small anchor pendant, aged and real, with a note in a different hand, older, on a small paper. From my wife to me on our wedding day. From Walter to Agnes. Agnes held the chain for a long while. Then she put it around her neck, over her blouse, above the wedding ring she wore on her finger. At the end of the morning, sitting on the bench outside the property, with a mug of coffee Marta had made on the small wood stove, Agnes looked at the land stretching out before her, the birch trees, the spruce, the serviceberry with its early buds, the glimmer of the lake through the vegetation, and ran a mental accounting. The Environmental Credits Trust. The deed to the property. The documentation proving the fraud on the Maple Avenue house. An honest attorney waiting for her call. And Daniel and Christine, at that moment, probably still asleep in the bedroom that had been Agnes and Walter's for 48 years, not knowing she had left, not knowing there was a property, not knowing there was a chest, not knowing what the chest contained. Walter, she said aloud, to the lake, to the shore, to the air. The lake ran. A loon called from somewhere out of sight. You did good work. Agnes called Mr. Larson the next morning from Marta's phone. The secretary answered on the first ring, as if Marta's number were recognized. And when Agnes said her name, I'm Agnes Louise Whitmore, Walter's wife, there was on the other end a very brief pause followed by a voice that changed entirely in quality, no longer formal, but present. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Larson has been waiting for your call. One moment. Mr. Larson had the voice of an older man who had spent 40 years in a profession he took seriously, low and precise, with the kind of warmth that exists below formality when someone has been waiting for something they knew would be important. He said he knew the situation completely, that he had worked with Walter since 2010, that the documents were in order and ready, that there were 2 legal fronts to consider, the annulment of the fraudulent transfer of the Maple Avenue house, and the criminal proceedings for forgery of a public document, and that as soon as Agnes could come to his office in person, they would initiate both. How long will it take? Asked Agnes. The annulment of the deed, with the documents we have, may take between 8 and 18 months depending on the judge and the caseload. But there is a protective possession order that Walter had already asked me to prepare as soon as I made contact with you. That order can be issued in 48 hours. What does that order do? It guarantees that no sale, renovation, or modification can be made to the Maple Avenue property until the final ruling. Any attempt at sale or transfer will be automatically blocked. Agnes was quiet for a moment. And Daniel and Christine, can they continue to live there? You may not want the house back, Mrs. Whitmore. It is an option. The process can include a restoration of possession, which in cases of occupation by family members. Mr. Larson paused with the delicacy of someone who knows they are talking about a son. Can be slow and emotionally difficult. What matters to me, said Agnes slowly, is that they cannot sell it, and that the process creates a legal record of what happened. The rest, time will resolve. That is exactly what we will do, said Mr. Larson. In the days that followed, settled provisionally in Eli and Marta's home, Agnes began organizing her life with the same methodology with which she had organized the chest. Everything in its place, each step in its time. She and Eli went to the property every day during that first week, generally in the mornings. The first visit had been one of recognition and emotion. The visits that followed were ones of evaluation and planning. The land, seen in daylight and in its various parts, exceeded everything the letter had anticipated. The 12 protected acres were traversed by a cold, clear stream, a minor tributary of the lake system, which created along its course a microenvironment of singular beauty. Old white cedar with robust trunks, balsam fir reaching above the forest canopy, wild orchids near the stream bank in colors that seemed improbable in that northern light, mergansers fishing the shallows, a pair of common loons that had nested in the protected cove at the corner of the property for so many years the local fishermen had given the female a name. The remaining 5 acres outside the protection zone, but within the property were a firm rolling terrain of open meadow and mixed forest, the kind of land that federal conservation programs had begun in the 2010s to value as part of regional restoration efforts. In that open area, a natural stand of serviceberry had grown without intervention. Between 180 and 220 mature shrubs, Eli estimated, with the experienced eye of someone who knew the region. Come June, the berries would be sweet and abundant. The serviceberry gives everything, said Eli one morning as they walked through the stand. Flower in spring, berry in summer, bark and wood year-round. Around here there are families who have made their living from one good stand of serviceberry. Walter knew they were here, said Agnes. Without a doubt, Mr. Gunnar planted the first ones. The rest came on their own. Mr. Walter walked through here every visit. I saw him. Agnes looked at the trees. She looked at the lake, through the break in the forest beyond. She thought about a man who had come here twice a year for 30 years, alone, sitting on rocks, with his feet on the cold shore, thinking. This is for Agnes. There was a space on the property along the stream bank, about 400 square feet of level ground, shaded by old cedar, with the sound of running water 3 feet away, where the earth was bare and packed, as if it had been used at some point for some purpose that years of disuse had not entirely erased. Eli said it had been, in the time of Gunnar, a place for cleaning and packing fish for the market. Agnes stood in that space for 20 minutes on one of those mornings, simply observing, with an idea that didn't yet have an exact name, but did have a shape. In the lake town, news did not travel slowly. By the second week of Agnes's stay, while she was still at Eli and Marta's and going to the property every day, the town already knew there was a new woman at the Whitmore land. It was a small community where the permanent residents were tightly connected, and the arrival of an elderly woman with a rusted key and a plastic bag had not gone unnoticed. It was a woman named Helvie who came first. Helvie Makinen, 67 years old, owner of the small provision store at the trail junction, quick and sharp-eyed, with the kind of practical hospitality that lake country people develop over generations of isolated winters. She arrived at the property one afternoon with a canvas bag containing dried beans, smoked lake trout, a wedge of aged cheese, a packet of wild rice, and a bottle of local cloudberry cordial. She said she had known Gunnar Whitmore, as a child, that Walter had bought provisions at her store on every single visit for nearly 30 years, and that any family of his was welcome as her own. And Walter, she said, seated on the outside bench, with the bag in her lap, was a man of few words, but very large action. When the ice storm of 2014 left the Nieminen family's dock completely destroyed, it was Walter who paid for the lumber, without saying where it came from. I knew because it was my store, and he came personally and asked me not to say anything. Agnes sat listening to that with her coffee mug in her hands. He never told me that, she said. He wouldn't, said Helvey. That kind of man doesn't tell. After Helvey came old Mr. Mackinnon, Helvey's uncle, a fisherman of 81, who had fished alongside Gunnar Whitmore in the 1960s, who arrived one morning with a mended net he said had belonged to Gunnar, kept in case someone ever came for it. After him came the woman who ran the local boat rental, wanting to know if Agnes needed any assistance navigating the regional licensing office for properties in the protected zone. After her came the retired schoolteacher, Mrs. Lane, who had heard, through Eli, that there was a woman newly arrived with the Whitmore key and who presented herself with the quiet warmth of someone who has been waiting to be useful. Each person who came brought something: information, food, history, an offer of help. There was in those visits a hospitality that was not performed or exuberant, but had the quality of things that are simply the natural way of being in a place. This lake community had been waiting for the arrival of whoever belonged to that property for years, without urgency, without impatience, with the serenity of people accustomed to waiting for what is theirs to come home. Agnes had decided to stay. The decision was not dramatic or announced. It happened gradually, over the first weeks, like an understanding that solidifies as you move toward it. The property was hers. The land was hers. The letter was there. Mr. Larson was working. The process had begun. And there was in that lakeshore community, in that community that received her without needing explanations, something she had not felt in the back room of Maple Avenue in 3 years. The sensation of belonging to a place that belonged to her. Eli and Marta helped make the property livable, with the practical efficiency of people who know every available resource in a small northern town. A new mattress bought at Helvey's store, paid for by Agnes, with part of the advance Mr. Larson had released, funds transferred, as soon as the process was initiated, as had been agreed in the contract with Walter. Running water from the artesian well on the property, which only needed a new pump that Eli's nephew installed in a single afternoon. A small second-hand wood stove for additional heating that Mrs. Lane had stored and used in her shed for years. A solar lamp that the boat rental woman had extra from a dock project. Agnes slept in the property for the first time in the second week of April. The mattress was firm. The window was open. The sound of Lake Superior arrived in soft, steady waves. The moonlight entered through the window frame and drew a pale rectangle on the plank floor. Agnes looked at that rectangle for a while. Then she closed her eyes and slept the sleep of someone who was in the right place. In Birchwood, the days passed, without Daniel noticing at first that his mother had truly gone. The first day Christine assumed Agnes had gone out early. She sometimes rose before dawn. The second day, when the back room was neat and silent, Christine looked more carefully and noticed the wedding ring was missing from the small dish on the nightstand, where Agnes sometimes left it at night. The third day, Daniel noticed that the old plastic shopping bag his mother used for errands had also disappeared. That was the day Christine said, "Daniel." She left. What followed was, for some weeks, a combination of indignation and calculation. Daniel called family members. None had any news. Christine called the county clerk's office to verify the status of the Maple Avenue deed. And it was on that call that she heard for the first time that there was a protective possession order registered in the name of Agnes Louise Whitmore over the Maple Avenue property. The clerk said the order had been issued by a judge in Duluth 4 days earlier. Christine was silent for a moment. Then she hung up and stood in the kitchen with her phone in her hand, looking at the gray tile she had put in place of Agnes's blue. "Daniel," she said. He was in the living room. "Your mother found an attorney." Daniel and Christine's trip to the lake town happened on a Saturday in May, 7 weeks after Agnes had arrived. They drove from Birchwood in a trip of nearly 6 hours along the route Agnes had taken by bus. They arrived in the late morning, with the sun already high. They asked at the first landmark they stopped at, Helvy's provision store at the trail junction, where the Whitmore property was. Helvy looked at them for a second. Then she said, "It's along the North Trail past the old fish camp. But Miss Agnes will be informed you're coming." She hadn't been, but Helvy was the kind of woman who doesn't let arrivals go unannounced. Agnes had that May morning a look Daniel had not seen on his mother in years. She was standing in front of the property when they arrived, not waiting for them, not anxious, simply there. She had cut her hair short and practical, using Marta's kitchen scissors at her own request. She wore Walter's gold chain around her neck, dark blue trousers Marta had given her, a white blouse she had bought at Helvy's store the week before. She was standing, with her hands loosely clasped in front of her, her gaze direct, the posture she had always carried, the posture of someone who knows her own worth without needing to announce it. Eli was inside the property, standing discreetly near the door. Marta was seated on the outside bench, conspicuously occupied with some mending she had no intention of setting down. Daniel got out of the car first. He was thinner than Agnes remembered, or seemed so, with the expression he wore, a mixture of calculation and something that might have been shame. Christine got out after him, dark sunglasses, her usual composure, heeled boots sinking into the packed earth of the trail. "Mom," said Daniel. "Daniel," said Agnes. Christine removed her glasses, looked at the property, the trees, the lake visible through the birches, Marta on the bench. She turned her gaze back to Agnes with an expression that had, in that moment, something almost like genuine assessment. Not the calculation of someone who was measuring an obstacle, but the involuntary acknowledgement of someone encountering something they didn't expect. "You left in the middle of the night," said Daniel, saying nothing. "Yes," said Agnes. "We were worried." "I can imagine." There was a quality to Agnes's tone, not hostile, not ironic, simply exact, that made each of her responses land precisely where it needed to land. Daniel paused, searching for how to continue. "You could have let me know, Mom. I'm your son." "You are my son," said Agnes, "and that may be the saddest part of everything that happened." Silence. "You can come inside," she said with a naturalness that disconcerted them both. "There's coffee." The interior of the property had changed in the 7 weeks since Agnes's arrival. It was the same space, the dark cedar walls, the plank floor, the shuttered windows, but there were unmistakable signs of a life being lived in it. The wood stove with a pot on it, the smell of fresh coffee, an embroidered tablecloth spread over the solid dining table, 2 clay jars with early wildflowers on the kitchen shelf, which Agnes had cut that morning along the stream bank. The chest had been moved to a corner, with a small rug on top of it, converted into a side table. On it, a photograph of Walter in a new frame beside a rosary, and a small birch bark carving that old Mr. Mackinnon had made for Agnes as a welcome gift. It was a small home, rustic, smelling of lake and cedar, but unmistakably a home. Christine looked at all of this, with her glasses in her hand, calculating. Daniel looked at his father's photograph. Agnes poured coffee into the white enamel mugs with blue rims that she had found in the property and washed and put back on the shelf. She set them on the table, sat down, folded her hands. Neither of them sat immediately. "Sit down," said Agnes. They sat. "Well," said Christine in her tone of always, sweet, correct, a fraction hollow. "Are you all right?" "Yes," said Agnes. "Better than I was." "And this place," said Christine, glancing around. You're going to stay here? Yes. It's very rustic. You're at an age where you need. Christine. Agnes's voice was not loud. It was simply exact. I lived 3 years in a 12 by 10 room, with a window facing a neighbor's fence. Don't tell me what I need. Christine closed her mouth. Daniel looked at the coffee in his mug. I'm going to be direct, said Agnes. Not because I enjoy conflict. I never have. But because I'm too old to waste time going around things. Mr. Larson is giving me an appointment in Duluth next week. The processes are already underway. The protective possession order that prevents any movement on the Maple Avenue house has been issued. The lawsuit to void the fraudulent deed transfer has been filed. Daniel looked up. Mom. Let me finish. She spoke calmly, without audible anger, which made every word weigh more than anger would have produced. Mr. Larson has complete documentation of how the deed was altered. He has the broker's name, the date, the forged signature. Those documents exist because your father, who loved you more than you deserved, arranged for them. Because he knew his son better than his son would have wanted to believe. Daniel was absolutely still. This isn't revenge, Agnes continued. I didn't come all the way here for revenge. I came because the key your father gave me was the path he left for me. And that path brought me to a place he prepared, over decades of quiet work and love. What happens with the Maple Avenue house will be resolved by the courts in the correct way. You can hire any attorney you want. Mr. Larson's documentation is what it is. The judge will decide. Christine opened her mouth, then closed it. And one more thing, said Agnes. The house that's being disputed, the Maple Avenue house you lived in for 3 years, as though it were yours, was built board by your father and by me. Every room has a piece of both of us in it. The blue tile in the kitchen that you had removed was a luxury I saved 3 weeks to afford. I chose it personally at the hardware store. In 1979, the year we moved in. She paused briefly. I don't want anger, Daniel. What I have is longing. For who you were, before you became who you are. For when you hugged me and meant it. For when what was in your face, when you looked at me, was love, not calculation. Daniel breathed deeply. In his eyes, for the first time since he had arrived, perhaps for the first time in years, there was something uncalculated. It was the expression of a child caught, but older and more tired than a child. It was real shame. And perhaps underneath everything, something remaining from the boy who had run through the yard catching fireflies on summer nights. But not enough. And Agnes, who had loved that boy her whole life, knew it. I want you to go now, she said. Not with anger. I have no anger toward you. But this place is mine. This land is mine. This process is mine. When the judge decides about the house, I'll let you know. Until then, you don't need to come back here. Christine was on her feet before Daniel. She picked up her bag, put on her glasses, looked at the property one last time. The cedar walls, the wood stove, Walter's photograph, the lake visible through the open window, with an expression that had, in that moment, slightly less calculation in it than before. Daniel stood slowly, remained standing for a moment, with the coffee mug still full and untouched, looked at his mother. There was in that look something that tried to speak and didn't. And Agnes recognized that moment, that space where one right word would have changed something. And she watched her son fail to find the word, as had always happened, as would probably happen again. Mom, he said, and said nothing more. Go, Daniel, said Agnes, with a gentleness that came from 48 years of love for a man who had never disappointed her, transferred that afternoon to the son who had chosen a different direction. Go. They left. The car pulled out along the dirt trail and disappeared among the birch trees. Agnes stood in the doorway of the property, listening to the sound of the car recede until it became silence. Then the lake took over again, that constant murmur of water that had become in just a few weeks the background sound of her life. Marta appeared at her side, the mending folded under her arm. How are you? "Fine," said Agnes. "I'm fine." And it was true. There was in her voice the serenity of someone who had been through the worst and arrived on the other side still standing. Not exuberant joy, something quieter and sturdier. The peace of someone who said what she needed to say, did what she needed to do, and was now going to live. May turned to June. June turned to July. The rains came to the Lake Superior country with their usual generosity. Long, slow rains that settled into the forest for days, feeding the streams, filling the soil, waking everything that had been waiting under the cold of the northern spring. On the Whitmore property, the serviceberry came into fruit, sweet and dark red, growing in the clusters Walter had described. Come June, Agnes went to the serviceberry tree on the south wall for the first time. She picked 2 berries. She ate the first one. Sweet, with the specific sweetness of northern fruit that doesn't have the luxury of a long, warm summer and concentrates everything it has into the brief season it gets. The second one rested for a moment in her fingers. Small, dark red, round. "This one's for you, Walter," she said, and ate it. The sun fell sideways over the property in that late June light that comes to Lake Superior country only for a few weeks in the year, golden and horizontal, making everything look older and more significant than it is. The idea that had been taking shape since that first week, the space along the stream bank, the level ground, the 400 feet of shaded flat earth between the cedar trees, took concrete form in a conversation with Helvey and Mrs. Lane in late June. A small wilderness retreat. Simple, built with the materials of the property and the region, for guest cabins at most. Lake kayaking included, guided by Eli, who had offered in the first weeks, with the casualness of someone doing something they've been waiting to do. Meals prepared by Agnes. Her wild rice soup, her smoked fish chowder, her serviceberry preserves she had been learning to make from Marta's recipe, and access during July and August to the protected shore of the property, private and exclusive for retreat guests, one of the only privately held stretches of pristine Lake Superior shoreline in the region. "A place like that," said Helvey when Agnes laid out the idea at the kitchen table, over coffee and rye bread one July evening, "can charge what it wants. Private Superior shoreline, with real northern food and a guide who knows the water. People come from everywhere for this." "I don't want to charge what I want," said Agnes. "I want to charge what's fair." "Fair around here is considerable," said Eli, and let out his short, genuine laugh. The construction project was planned through August and started in September, with resources from Mr. Larson's advance and a portion of the environmental credits that had been released. Agnes hired a local contractor, a woman in her early 40s named Rita, quiet and precise, as Walter had been, and 2 local assistants. She followed every phase herself, sometimes offering input, sometimes simply watching, with the look she had learned alongside Walter. The look that evaluates, that notices quality, that recognizes when something is being done with care. For guest cabins were built of cedar shake and spruce timber in the style of the original structure. Each cabin had a window oriented toward the stream, so guests could fall asleep to the sound of running water. Each had simple, comfortable beds, a small wood stove, proper insulation against the northern winter. The original property structure was preserved exactly as it was, restored only with replacement of some weathered planks and reinforcement of the cedar shake roof. It was converted into the retreat's central gathering space. Common room, shared kitchen, dining area for all guests. The 400 square feet along the stream bank, the level ground that had waited decades, became the outdoor dining area. A long harvest table with benches on both sides, covered by a cedar bark roof supported by old spruce trunks. Copper lanterns along the perimeter that were lit at night with warm amber light, surrounded by native vegetation, with the sound of the stream 3 feet away. And at night, the open sky of the Lake Superior country in its full extension of stars, which in that remote northern latitude had a depth and density that people who live in lit cities have forgotten exists. Agnes named the retreat one evening in October, seated at the long table, with Eli and Marta, and Helvey and Rita and Mrs. Lane, after the first meal served in the new space. A clay pot of wild rice and smoked lake trout she had spent all morning preparing. Shoreline, she said, because that's what it is. It's where the land meets the water. It's where you stop and you stay. It's where you can hear yourself again. Helvey approved. Eli approved with the nod of someone who would approve of anything with that pot of rice and trout in front of him. The retreat opened to guests in May of the following year. The first guests were a couple from Chicago who had found the listing on a wilderness travel forum. They stayed 5 days. On the last morning, the woman, a doctor in her early 50s, with the look of someone who carries difficult things and is trying, briefly, to set some of them down, sat, with Agnes at the long table, over coffee before they left and asked, "How did you end up here?" Agnes thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Through a key my husband kept for me." The doctor looked at her for a moment. "And what was he like?" "He was the kind who does a lot and says little," said Agnes. "The kind who plants and waits, and when you finally harvest, you understand everything he always meant to say." The doctor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know that what you just told me is one of the most beautiful things I've heard in a very long time?" Agnes looked at the lake visible through the break in the trees beyond the stream. "It's what life does," she said, "when you give it time." In the months that followed, Shoreline Retreat found its place in the conversation of those who traveled to the Lake Superior country. Not through advertising. Agnes never bought any, but through word of mouth that begins when a place is genuinely good. The doctor from Chicago sent her sister. The sister sent 3 colleagues. A journalist from a Minneapolis outdoor magazine appeared in August, without calling ahead, stayed 4 days, and published a feature with photographs of the lake at dawn, the cedar cabins in the birch light, the long harvest table lit by copper lanterns at night. The piece was read by people who had never heard of that stretch of Superior shore. By October, there was a waiting list for summer. Agnes woke every morning at 5:40, as she had for decades. But now she went outside barefoot to the property's stream bank, not to a backroom window. She walked to the water, stood at the bank for a few minutes listening to the mergansers wake up. Then she came back, lit the wood stove, made the coffee. When the guests came down to breakfast, generally between 6:30 and 7:30, one by one, with the slow rhythm of people who slept well, the coffee was ready, the rye bread was warm, and Agnes was seated at the long table, with her enamel mug. Available for conversation. Or for silence. According to what each guest needed. In April of the following year, the Maple Avenue lawsuit received its first ruling. The judge had recognized the prima facie evidence of documentary fraud and had ordered judicial oversight of the property, suspending any possibility of sale or modification until the final verdict. The criminal proceedings for forgery of a public document had been assigned to a prosecutor's office and were underway. Mr. Larson called Agnes personally to inform her. She heard the news sitting on the outside bench of the property, Walter's chain around her neck, feet bare on the packed earth. She thanked him with the sobriety of someone receiving confirmation they already expected. When she hung up, she was quiet for a moment. Then she called Marta, who was picking serviceberry leaves from the tree in the yard, and said, the case moved forward. Marta set down the leaves and came to hug Agnes, without saying anything. They stood like that for a moment, 2 women on the shore of Lake Superior on an April afternoon, with the sun low, and the lake visible, and the smell of birch sap just beginning in the warming air. In September of that year, exactly 15 months after Agnes's arrival, Mr. Larson mailed an envelope with the updated annual assessment of the environmental credits for the property. The value had risen to $598,000 for the current year, following a revision to the Federal Conservation Reserve Program. that had increased the calculation base for lands in the buffer zones of protected natural areas. Agnes opened the envelope at the property table, with Eli seated across from her and the coffee mugs going cold between them. She read the number aloud. Eli let out a low, quiet whistle. "I need to ask you something," said Agnes. "Ask." "You mentioned last spring that you were thinking about retiring from boat guiding. How serious were you?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. "Marta has been telling me I work too many hours for a man my age." "I know, which is why I didn't talk to her first." Eli let out his short, genuine laugh. "I have a permanent position available. Shoreline guide. Fixed salary. Year-round. Not seasonal." Eli looked at the coffee. Then he looked up. "What does Marta say?" "She doesn't know yet." He nodded slowly. "She's going to tell me I'm foolish if I don't say yes." "I know." "Then I'd better say yes." There was an envelope Agnes had not mentioned to anyone yet. It had arrived in September by mail from Mr. Larson's office. Inside was a short note from the attorney saying, "Mrs. Whitmore, while organizing the final inventory documents, we found a sealed envelope with the following note in Mr. Walter's own handwriting for Agnes. Once everything is resolved, we are sending it as instructed." The inner envelope was of heavy brown paper sealed with the tape Walter used for everything. On the front, in his large slanted handwriting, for Agnes, "Once everything is resolved." She had kept that envelope in the bottom of the chest for 3 weeks while she thought about what resolved meant. When the court ruling came in April, she felt it was becoming resolved, but not completely. When the credit value arrived in September and Eli accepted the position, she felt a different kind of conclusion, not a process, but of structure. The structure was standing. Life was standing. She opened the envelope one September morning, alone, before coffee. It was a single sheet of paper, large handwriting, wide spacing. Walter had written the way he always did, when he wanted every word to be read slowly. "Agnes, if you're reading this, it's because you built again. You always knew how to build. I only needed to leave you the land." Under the main structure, in the right corner, there's a loose floorboard that gives when you press on it. Under it is a tin cookie box with a screw lid. Inside is what was left to my father from a whole life of fishing. 6 gold coins he was given as payment for a salvage job on a wrecked vessel in Lake Superior in 1961, and that he never spent. He always said they were for a very great need. I think the need he imagined was you. And one more thing. The serviceberry gives fruit in late June. You already know that. But with the first fruit of June, we have to eat together. Every year, in spirit, but together. You eat one for yourself and one for me. And while you're eating, that second one, think, Walter is here. He never left. With all the love that fit in 68 years. Yours, Walter. Agnes folded the letter. She was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the right corner of the main structure, crouched, pressed her fingers against the plank floor until she felt one give. She lifted it. The tin box was there. A faded blue cookie tin, with a screw lid, that gave with some effort. Inside, wrapped in a piece of dark green wool, were 6 gold coins. Old and heavy, the deep yellow of things made to last. She held them in her palm for a moment. Then she closed her hand. Then she went to the serviceberry tree, which still had a few late clusters of fruit in the September warmth. She picked 2 berries. She ate the first one. The second one rested for a moment between her fingers. Small, dark, sweet. "This one's for you, Walter," she said. And ate it. The September sun fell sideways, over the property, golden and slanted, as it only falls in the last weeks, before the northern autumn closes in. The birds sang at the stream. The lake murmured beyond the tree line. Agnes stood in the yard of the property for a long moment, barefoot on the packed earth, the gold chain around her neck. the wedding ring on her hand, the 6 coins closed in her right fist. 73 years old. A rusted key. $83. A plastic bag. And the love of a man who had begun leaving her messages decades before she needed to receive them. It was a great deal. It was the right amount. It was, she thought, the specific feeling of having never once been forgotten. The property that had been an abandoned outbuilding was a home. The woman who had been called a burden was the owner of her life, her land, her lake, her mornings, her June fruit. She was the owner of her own story. And that story had not ended. In that moment, it was only beginning.